Okay, so there we are with the seamless transition there into our next into our next section today. And actually, we're going to be coming home. We're going to be talking a little bit about Britain, the authentic nation. And this is actually something which has come up in the writings of a particular commentary artist called Melanie Phillips. Can you possibly just fill us in a little bit on that one, Andy?
Yeah, Melanie Phillips is essentially a journalist, a very well-known journalist in the UK. She began life on the left of the political spectrum, and writing for various publications, including the Observer and the Guardian. But in the course of her career, she's made the kind of journey that actually a fair number of people do, I guess, across more towards the political right. She's also Jewish by heritage, and has taken very outspoken positions in support of the State of Israel, against nations like Iran. She has also written about the threat, as she sees it, to Western countries of militant Islam. And obviously this plays very much to the awful events we saw in Westminster yesterday. Although actually we planned to talk about this before that happened, obviously. So you have somebody who's a journalist. It's probably not fair to call her a professional controversialist in the sense that somebody like, say, Katie Hopkins is, but is arguably. But she's certainly somebody who holds controversial views, and often about nation and identity.
And in particular, what she was writing about in the Times earlier this month was this idea of Britain as a discrete unit of nationhood, which has been as such since time immemorial. In particular, as a discrete unit which was discovered essentially by the Romans. The Romans came across Britain as a unit. And also, actually, strangely enough, in opposition to, for example, younger nations, such as, for example, the nation of Ireland. Basically, I think she was making the argument that in particular, post-Brexit, not only is Britain reclaiming its authentic nationhood in a historical sense, but also that, for example, Scotland should not countenance leaving the United Kingdom, because that would be counter to the natural order of things in that respect. And I think the main reason why we're commenting on it, though, is the fact that this is, as we have touched on in previous episodes, but also I think as we will continue to touch on, this is actually a very overt abuse, and indeed a very overt deployment of pseudo-history in defence of a current political opinion, if not the status quo. And actually this was backed up a few days later, I think possibly even the next day, by an article from the former Education Secretary Michael Gove in the Times, where he talked about Theresa May as being our first Catholic Prime Minister. Now that is arguable because obviously Tony Blair, it seems, wanted to convert to Catholicism before he left office, but he didn't for the sake of propriety or whatever. But it's interesting how it feels. I mean, I was saying to you yesterday actually that it feels a little bit as though we're living in times that are being re-emphasised and remodelled as almost appropriately Elizabethan. It's like a neo-Elizabethan, anti-European, anti-Armada, propping up a lady as a defender and all this kind of. It's a very strange political narrative, and surely one of the roles of archaeologists and historians should be to actually really be examining these claims, especially from journalists who essentially are picking up on very popularist notions now and applying them to history and archaeological periods, which frankly even the experts don't fully understand.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we are living through a period of weaponized perceptions of heritage. I think to maybe coin a phrase. I was very interested in your invocation of the idea of Elizabeth I, Gloriana there. As and you inevitably think of the famous Armada portrait of Elizabeth I with the sinking Spanish fleet in the in the background as she sat there in this glorious ivory-coloured bejeweled dress.
I think recently in the Daily Mail actually, it was strongly hinted that Theresa May sees herself as a latter-day Elizabeth I. It's a very real phenomenon.
And I think that's very interesting as well, because although the British royal family is now constitutionally effectively redundant, except in name, because the government and the armed forces and police and so on operate in the name of the Queen, not in the name of the Prime Minister or the state. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen it commented very publicly that the various of the royals are being dispatched around Europe on official visits, which is all about the pre-Brexit negotiation positioning, but also we've seen a very interesting essay in the Guardian looking at what would happen between the death of the current Queen and her funeral and the coronation of her successor, which the very fact that that's been published suggests a certain, to me anyway, a certain lack of confidence. And I think it's interesting that almost Downing Street has almost had to replace the real monarch with this artifice of the Prime Minister as the monarch and the head of state. Because they can do that, they can politicise that, but they can't politicise Elizabeth II. No.
And also what's interesting there is that is the role of the monarchy, and I don't want to get into republicanism versus whether or not we support the roles, but the role of the monarchy is as you say, it is head of state, as opposed to being a monarch, literally the sole person in charge, versus being the person who is essentially giving their blessing to what is going on in the country. I suppose what I find most interesting about this is the fact that hasn't been examined in terms of its historical context. We're not having a deconstruction or some sort of essentially, frankly, amateur analysis of the history of and the veracity of the political norms as were established following the Civil War in the UK. What we're actually having is a much more emotive invocation of Britishness and this sceptred isle and all that kind of thing, going all the way back to, as I say, this idea that somehow Caesar, when he set foot on these islands, encountered a unit of people unlike anyone else in the world. This idea of authenticity is fascinating, and I think it's fascinating that it's being called on now.
I think it's very interesting that that kind of argument is being raised now, and certainly, but I think it's worth pointing out that the kind of media outlets that we're talking about, where people like Michael Gove and Melanie Phillips tend to publish, the Times, the Mail, have the Mail in particular have championed that kind of view for a long time. That a while back now, that the Mail championed the republication of a book called Our Island Story, which was a narrative history of the British Isles. It's interesting that the title was Our Island Story, not Our United Kingdom Story or Our Story. It was Our Island Story. It is that Shakespearean, this sceptred isle. And it doesn't allow for anyone to dissent from that without appearing to be somehow subversive. At the same time, as any archaeologist, historian will point out, the very concept of even a United Kingdom is an incredibly mutable thing. It's only a few hundred years old. The Acts of Union at the beginning of the 18th century, Ireland only becomes independent in 1922. Or the Republic of Ireland becomes independent in 1922 as the Free State. So it is not one monolithic narrative.
No.
And particularly, and I think that the biggest mistake people like Phillips make is to go back to look at the Roman invasion and say that the Romans came upon a united. They didn't. From what we know of that period, we're looking at a patchwork of tribal kingdoms occupying what's now England, Wales, Scotland, and the island of Ireland, which have shifting alliances and cultures and so on.
But also, there's also a tremendous irony here, in so much as some of the most well-known Iron Age finds in the UK come from, for example, a site like Wet Wang Slack. We'll try and keep giggling to a minimum. But that was from the Parisi, from people who had moved to Britain, possibly as a ruling class, into what is now Yorkshire, from the Parisian Basin. The connections, not only within but also without Britain, are so incredibly complex from that period, but also before that in the Bronze Age. For example, we have people coming from Israel, what is now Israel, to Cornwall to get tin in order to make bronze. It's a willful misunderstanding of what being an island means, and I think actually this has its root in something which my wife, in her first life, as it were, as an undergraduate, as a classical historian, and linguist, she always loved the irony that actually the sea is not a barrier, or was not a barrier to ancient people. It was in fact a motorway. So the rise of ancient Greece after the Dark Ages was facilitated by the sea, and the same goes for the relationship between Britain and the rest of Europe.
Absolutely, and again, in my previous more respectable role as a archaeologist and researcher, so maritime archaeology wasn't a speciality and a passion, and I'd absolutely endorse that. I think it's very easy for us to overestimate, well, in fact wrong of us often, to include modern political concepts of nation and culture and project those back into history. We mustn't do that. We have to work with the evidence that we have from the period we're looking at, not with what we want to see in terms of what we live with now. I think that's the danger of this, the kind of thing that Gove and Phillips and others, not just on the political right, but politically, particularly at the moment, it's this kind of nativist tradition is coming to the fore in many Western countries and in the United States. The idea that there's some homogenous national identity, which isn't true.
No. And I think, and this is something that I touched on recently with a video that I shot with Dr. Paul Harrison. You'll be able to see it on the channel, those of you who are interested, if you haven't already watched it. But there are some serious questions to be asked by archaeology of modern day identity, and especially, for example, the nation state. The idea of the nation state is a fascinating phenomenon, but it is the most artificial cultural construct ever enforced on humanity. And yet we are voracious in our defence of nationhood. We go to war quite literally in defence of nationhood, but also we react so quickly when people ask questions about the origins of nationhood. And some of this stuff will be based on very strange old biases that actually we may no longer agree with. There are nations, there are parts of nations which have separated out simply based on, for example, clothing type or how certain words are pronounced, which today they've become nation states, and that's why this person and that person don't necessarily get along. But or for example, they're on the cusp of becoming nation states. But all of this stuff essentially has its roots in for better or for worse, a certain understanding of history, and I think especially at moments like this, people are they are invoking history and histories which are politically expedient and usually not particularly accurate.
I think, to be fair though, we have to acknowledge that this has been going on for a long time. If you look at the 18th century, you have on the one hand people like Stukely and just before him Aubrey, who are invoking this mythical pre-Roman world of King Brutus and the Druids and so on. and at the same time creating a national identity, and at the same time you've got somebody like Jonathan Swift satirizing those kind of ideas with the big enders and the little enders feuding in Gulliver's Travels, over which end of an egg you open. It's
little end, obviously.
It's what we do. We look for identities. We look for our boxes to feel comfortable in. We look for the silos to protect ourselves from the views that we don't want to hear. That very current argument that we're becoming increasingly divided by our social media, when Google chooses for us the things that it thinks we want to read about, rather than the things that are maybe good that we read about. It's what we were talking about earlier when we were talking to Aaron about the American political system. It's very easy just to read commentators from the right or commentators from the left, the Republican or the Democrat, the pro-Trump, the anti-Trump, and not look at the large proportion of people who take a contrary view to what you do. Sometimes it's not very comfortable to be confronted with alternative views, but actually, if society's going to be healthy, we have to be.
And I'm not quite sure where you've ended up there, in so much as yes, you're absolutely right. Alternative views are welcome and are necessary, but at the same time, there's alternative, and then there's just made up. To be blunt, and I think that's really the angle from which I think we came into this story, is that if someone is deploying history for their own means, just for the sake of it, regardless of whether or not that is just what politicians do, it needs to be challenged. And so, as you say, I mean, yes, there was the narratives in the past which challenged, for example, this idea of a pre-Roman Britain in a sort of a satirical way, and perhaps that's the way forward today. But it's just interesting that newspapers will pay opinionistas, as it were, and opinionatras to comment on the historical context of the current political situation, and that's just taken as writ. These are interesting times that we live in, and undoubtedly historical. But surely the historical times are best informed by a clear view of their actual context.
Don't get me wrong, and in fact, I spend a lot of my time these days looking at pseudo history, pseudo documentary, these constructed, storylined, even narratives that we're presented with on television and in the non-specialist media. I think one of the big problems we have as a profession, as historians, as archaeologists, is the failure to indulge or engage at almost a sort of hand-to-hand in the trenches level with people who peddle this sort of stuff. Where was when when Melanie Phillips published her piece, or Michael Gove published his piece, where was the
where was someone like Colin Renfrew?
Where exactly? Somebody of that kind
Lord
of standing.
Renfrew, yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, someone who's prepared to write a popular, challenging, informed, contrary narrative to what's being presented. Because at the moment, this stuff's going unanswered by and large, except in the fringe specialist social media.
Our small seeds into the wind.
Absolutely.
Well,
but I think the point is, a seed has to be given time to grow, or it gets choked or trodden on, or eaten by the bigger animals that come walking through.
That said, though, seeds of knowledge, just like seeds in the real world, often do very well in massive piles of bullshit. So let's move forward, shall we?